Okay, I'm going to start. So I'm Talia. We're going to be talking about testing in production today. Yeah, I'm excited. I've given this talk a few times before, and I like getting people's reaction to it. I'm also really happy people are sitting in the front row, so thank you. No one ever sits in the front row at any of my talks, and I get really upset, so kudos, thank you. So I'm Talia. I'm a lead developer advocate for Akamai, and I work on the cloud, mostly with Linode nowadays. Before I was a dev advocate at Akamai, I worked at a very small cloud computing company. You may have heard of it. It's called Amazon Web Services. And then before I was a dev advocate, I was a test engineer for 5 or 6 years. So I transitioned from being a test engineer to being a dev advocate. And one of the things that happened, I want to share with you a story, something that happened to me when I was interviewing for a position when I was a test engineer. And so this happened to me pretty early in my testing career. And I was sitting down for this interview, and the interview is going like really well. And I'm answering all the coding questions correctly. I'm running, answering things as they come. And I'm feeling really confident in this interview. And the interviewer, you know how at the end of every interview that they ask you like, oh, do you have any questions for me? Like, well, how's it? What can I answer for you? So I look at the guy and I'm like, yeah, how do you do your deployments? Like, what time do you guys deploy, and like when's your downtime for staging, and how do deployments work? Like, when does each team have time to test? Like, when do you run different deployments and things like that? And then they said that they don't have a staging environment. They test in production. And I heard this in the interview, and I was so confused. I was like, what do you mean you test in production? This doesn't make any sense to me. I was working in like a pretty big like corporate company at the time when I was doing this interview. And that company, you have Tuesdays and Thursdays between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. That's when they do builds to staging, and you can't use the environment at that time. Or staging will be down because they're doing performance testing. Or there's like all this stuff that happens in staging, and I had never heard of testing in production before. And I was in the middle of this interview, and I was so confused. And he could see that I was confused. He was like, clearly you've never heard of this before, but he had me do something that I want you all to try now. So I want everybody to think about the last feature that your team deployed. So you got it, you're thinking about like something specific that's in production. Okay, is it working right now? In production? How do you know? Your users haven't reported anything to you, like your alarms haven't gone off, like no one's been paged. You don't know that your features are working, right? You just, you assume. So testing in production is the only way to know that your features are working right now in production. And so this is one of the main things about testing in prod. It's you're testing features in the environment that your features will live in. So you're not using a dummy environment like staging. You're not using cert or beta or one of the other 1,000 names that they've come up with. You're using production. And like I'll talk about later in this session is testing in prod doesn't mean you only test in prod. There's specific circumstances where you might not want to do this. So this is one of the big things with testing in prod is like, it's not the only place you test, it's one of the places that you should be testing. Okay, so most companies, and all the companies that I had worked for before this one that I was interviewing for, they all used a test environment or a staging environment. So show of hands, who here uses a test environment? Okay, now keep your hand up if it's an exact replica of production. Exact. Okay, liars, but fine. So testing in production is really, it's not the way to go here, and there's a few reasons why. So this is what I've learned like through my experience as a test engineer. So staging environments are really, really expensive to maintain, right? They cost like hundreds of thousands of dollars per year, and they're, you know, that price just keeps growing as you add more things to production. Staging test results do not always match production test results. So imagine you're testing a feature in staging. Let's say you're a developer and you're building this feature, and you deploy it to staging, and you test it in staging, and you worked so hard to make sure that it works, and you go to staging to test it. You went through, you know, the documentation with the product owner. You worked with, you know, other developers to fix any bugs that you had. You worked with the test engineer. All of your end-to-end tests that you wrote are passing in staging. You feel so good, and you sign off on the feature. You're like, yes, this looks great. And then you launch the feature to production, and what happens? There's a bug. So these environments are so different, plain and simple. Like the test results that you get from staging a lot of times will not match production, and this is like, you know, what every test engineer goes through when you're testing in staging versus production. So production includes data that staging doesn't have, and you're never going to know the differences between your staging and production environments until you test in prod. No one cares if staging is broken. So picture this. You are testing a high priority fix for something that needs to go out, and you log into staging to test it, but staging is down, of course. You get the 404 screen of death. So you ping the DevOps guy, but he's not answering. So you ping your manager, but like she's at lunch, and then she tells you to open an IT ticket, and then your manager has to like escalate this ticket for you. And meanwhile, you're just trying to fix this high priority ticket. You're just trying to, you know, get your feature working again, and no one seems to care. So no one's going to get a call in the middle of Thanksgiving dinner if staging is down. Like, nobody cares. The load in staging does not match production. So when you think of the number of people who use staging versus the number of people who use production, the difference of that is a lot, right? And so because the load is different, the accuracy of like speed and lag times is going to be different. A lot of times when you write end-to-end tests, you have to add like, you know, wait for 10 seconds for this thing to appear, or like sleep for 5 seconds or 20 seconds for like this other thing to happen, right? But like your users aren't going to wait for 20 seconds for a button to appear. Like that's not reality. Okay, so the last reason is configuration drift. So let's say you get paged one night because there's an incident for your mobile application, and you look at the logs, you identify what the issue is, and in order to fix the issue, you have to make a configuration change in production. So you go to production, you make the configuration change, and you go back to sleep because it's like the middle of the night. But even though you fixed the issue, you've just created an even bigger divide between your staging and production environments because you didn't make the same change in your staging environment. So a lot of times, staging and production grow farther and farther apart because of these changes made during incident management, and that's called configuration drift. And at the end of the day, I've never heard anyone speak highly of their testing environment, except for like the three of you who think that your staging environment is the same as production. And I know what you're thinking, like, what could go wrong? You're testing in prod, like it's all fine. But what's the first thing you do right after you deploy a feature to production? You go to production and you test it, right? Okay, so why isn't everyone doing this? Like, if this is such a great practice and this is like a well-known, you know, thing that people do, like I had never heard of it before, but if this is something that makes such a big difference, like why isn't every company doing this? So companies don't test in prod because of fear and this lack of trust in their systems, and that's why they don't invest in the tools and process changes that are going to generate that trust. So this is a really risky process if you don't do it correctly. So I'm going to walk you through how to set this up together. We're going to go through all the steps of testing in prod. We're going to go through all the tools. And yeah, let's do that. So the first step to testing in prod is to install the necessary tools. And the first tool you need is kind of the foundation of testing in prod. It's feature flagging. And so feature flagging is a way to decide who sees which features. It's used to hide, enable, or disable features at runtime. So basically what this means is you're separating code deployment from feature release. So just because you deploy code and you deploy it to production doesn't mean that that feature is live for everybody to see. You can control that. So this is kind of what it looks like. So your developers would create a feature flag from the UI and then target all of your internal teammates. So this includes developers, QA, product design, your automation bots, and I'll touch on this in a minute. So anything related to the feature can only be seen by these users that are inside of the feature flag. Everything else, if you're not in the feature flag, you don't see anything related to those changes. You don't see anything related to that feature because you're not in the feature flag, you're not targeted, it's none of your business. So if there happens to be a bug in your feature, it has no impact on those end users. It has no impact on the people who are not in the feature flag because they're not targeted and they don't have access to it. So while the feature flag is off, this is where you go in and you test everything. This is where you check all of the functionality, you go through all of the requirements, you make sure everything is working while you have access to it while the feature flag is off. And then once you know your feature is working in production, you turn the flag on, already knowing my feature is working in production, it didn't break anything that was existing, and now I can turn the feature flag on and I already know that it works. And now your users are, happy because you released a feature without any bugs. And then you repeat this process for every new feature. So each feature has its own feature flag. And it can be overwhelming when you're testing in parallel with different feature flags. Sometimes features have parts that are, maybe one feature affects another feature, or maybe it's an update, or maybe something happens that you need to have more than one feature flag for a specific feature because there's different settings or different configurations. So it can be tricky to decide which sets of flags to test. What I would recommend is working with your product owner to prioritize what the different combinations of feature flags are that you need to test and choose the most important flows. So this means if you have 100 feature flags, you want to make sure that you test the right combinations. You want to make sure that you keep up to date and remove the feature flags once you're done with them, which we'll talk about. And you want to make sure that your automation bots are all maintained correctly, that nobody goes in to delete them from your feature flagging UI, and I'll show you that too. So it can be overwhelming when you have a lot of feature flags, but maintenance is a big key here. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through how to do this. The tool that I'm using right now is Split. Full disclosure, I used to work for Split, but I don't care which feature flagging tool you use. There's LaunchDarkly, there's CloudBees, there's 100 feature flagging tools. I'm not here to sell you a product. I'm here to teach you about testing in prod. So use whatever tool you want. This is what it looks like in Split. Okay, so the first thing you have to do is create your feature flag, and this is what it looks like in Split. The first thing you do is you name your feature flag, and then this is the name that you include in your code, which I'll show you in the next slide. And then the traffic type defines what differentiates the people who see your feature and the people who don't see your feature. So you can say, this feature is only for like iOS users, or this feature is only for people in Europe, or this feature is for whatever you want. I like to do it by user so that I can control who sees the feature and who doesn't very specifically. And then once you create the feature flag, you set up your targeting rules. And again, your targeting rules define who sees your feature and who doesn't. So here I'm saying if you're in this list, you can see the feature, you have access to the feature. And notice that the test user is inside of the feature flag. So in this case, this robot is targeted in the feature flag. So when this robot runs the automation test, it's going to log in, it's going to have access to the feature, it's going to run everything. And I do this while the feature flag is off, because this way the robot is going to catch any bugs before I turn the feature flag on. And then in the code, you say, if the user is in this feature flag, give them treatment on, or else give them treatment off. And then this is what the test looks like. So you log in with this test user, you go to this page, do whatever actions you need to do, perform whatever test you need to perform, and you're going to expect that feature to work because this user has access. And if this fails, it means you caught a bug. And I also just want to, while I'm on this topic, a lot of times when tests fail, you think, oh, it's just there's something wrong with the test, or something wasn't, updated correctly, or, it works like that. It fails sometimes. I just want to say there's no such thing as a flaky test. Like if your test is failing, it means something's wrong. So in production, when you're testing in prod, that goes like 10x. There really is no such thing as a flaky test. If you're running a test and it fails, something's wrong, go fix it. Maybe you're not waiting long enough for something. Maybe there's actually a problem. Maybe there's actually a bug that your test caught. So no such thing as flaky tests. Okay, so I have a little pop-up. Hold on, snooze. Okay, the cherry on top of this cake is that when you turn on your feature flag in production, you already know that your features are working, right? So there's no surprises. It really is like the worst feeling in the world when like you spent so much time testing something and staging, and then you feel so good about it, you spent so much time, and then you deploy it to production and there's a problem. Like that is the worst feeling. As a test engineer, as a developer, as anyone in that process, like that's not a good feeling. So this kind of takes care of that. Okay, so the next tool after feature flagging that you need is an automation framework. I think this is pretty self-explanatory, but it's not scalable to test everything manually, so you're going to need an automation framework, one that's easy to adopt, easy to debug, one that has good reporting, one that has a good support community. And I'll go through some of my, that's interesting. I'll go through some of my favorites in a little bit. Okay, the next tool you need is a job scheduler. And the job scheduler is just going to run the tests for you. So you can do this as a cron job, like every hour, like run these tests in prod. Or you can do it through something like Jenkins that will run the tests for you on every build. This is totally customizable. The next tool you need is an alerting tool, and you want to choose an alerting tool that can be integrated with your job scheduler, so when a test fails, someone gets alerted. It's important that everybody on your team, from product to design to engineering, is on call for when tests fail, because everybody on the team owns product quality. It's not just the test engineer's responsibility to make sure that your features are working. So make sure that everybody's on call. These are some of the tools that I've used for testing in prod. I don't care what tools you use. These are the ones that I've used that I recommend. I don't have anything specific to say about any of these, except that for your automation framework, I really like Robot Framework. I don't know if you guys have used it before, but it's like it's a Python-based, keyword-driven automation framework that I love. They're not like sponsoring me or anything yet, but I am obsessed with robot framework. So if you're brand new to automation or testing or any of that, like robot is definitely the way to go. Split and launch darkly, they're the same thing. Harness has feature flagging, CloudBees has one. Job scheduling, I mean, these are literally all the same. Alerting, I suggest using like 2 or 3 different alerting tools at the same time, because you can use one for like, okay, 911, something's, wait, in England, is it 911 or is it, what is it? 119? Oh, 999, that's, okay. You know, 999, something's wrong. Or, you know, if everything's passing and all the tests work and everything, then you can do, you know, like a Slack message, like everything's fine, move on. Okay, so after you have all of your tools installed, you need to create your test data. And so the problem is, and this is where a lot of people get scared, because you are creating test data in production. So you need a way to create and manipulate test data in production without affecting real end users or any data and analytics. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a consistent naming convention for our test users. And this is something like a Boolean, right? Like is test user is true or is test is true. Something that's specific for these test users that you're creating. And these test users, like the robot that I put into the feature flag, they act like real users, they look like real users, but only we would be able to interact with them. So everything that happens with this person is test user equals true, gets put into a different database or in this other table, or you know, there's this other place in your Datadog dashboard that like all of the data goes there, or you know, you have some way to separate them because of this Boolean, because of this specific thing. And it doesn't have to be this Boolean, it can be something else, but this is something that you and your team can decide on together. And this way you can differentiate between people's real interactions and your test interactions. And the most important thing here is you need to follow these specific predetermined guidelines, and your entire team needs to agree on them. So if you decide like we're going to do is test user equals true, that means you know, all of your business stakeholders need to know like everything that has this is test user equals true is going to go in this other database. It's not going to be looked at for like business decisions. It's not going to be looked at for anything else besides like testing purposes. Okay, next you need to write your tests. I like BDD because it's just simple to read and write. You know, given when then like Gherkin Cucumber, it works really well with robot framework. There's a lot of times when you're writing your tests, there's third parties. Like it's very rare that you will write an end-to-end test that is only within your platform, your product. There's many times there's, you know, external third parties like payment providers. There's, you know, a bunch of e-commerce tools. There's different third parties that can be integrated within your product. And so when I'm handling third parties, what's best for me is to have a header in the API request that you send to the third party, and then work with them and say, hey, any request that you get from this header is going to be for a test, and I want you to handle it differently, like do this other thing, put it over here, like don't process this or do X, Y, and Z. And I've done this a few times, and I've never had a problem. But yeah, I would put that in the API request. Another part of writing your tests is the setup and teardown, and this I think is more important than the test itself, especially when you're testing in prod. So in your setup, you want to clear cookies, log in as the test user, make sure that you're starting from a blank slate. Then you perform the test, right? You validate all the functionality, you make sure that the feature is working. Then in the teardown, you undo everything that your test did. You know, make sure you clean up that test data. And then if any step fails, you get alerted immediately and the tests stop. So this is one of those things that might be a little bit different than like a normal test suite, is that when a test fails in production, it's a problem, like go fix it. It's not, oh, you know, that test sometimes fails and it's fine. No, that doesn't happen. Okay, next, The next step is to deploy to a production canary. So production canaries allow you to slowly roll out a change to a small subset of users before you roll it out to the entire population. And what this does is it minimizes the impact if something goes wrong. So let's say that you turn on the feature flag and there's a problem. Like something happened where you didn't catch the bug. You didn't there was a bug and you didn't see it, and then you turn on the feature flag and now you have this issue in production. So if that happens, would you want 100% of your users to encounter that issue or 1%? So this is adding that layer of risk mitigation, so even after you turn on the feature flag, you can say, hey, turn it on for just 5% of the population or 1% or whatever you want. And if there is an issue, you can identify it, roll back to a better version, and then fix the issue in this controlled environment. And when you're ready, turn the feature flag back on. And something I suggest, just due to its sensitivity, is that infrastructure and configuration changes should always be released with a canary. This is what it looks like to set up a canary. It's just like this little toggle, and you can say, 1%, 5% of people. Okay, so to summarize risk mitigation, before launch, use feature flags to target your users. After launch, use production canaries to limit your audience in case something does go wrong. Thirdly, I would say use an AA test. An AA test is when you give your users, both inside and outside of the feature flag, the same experience. And so what that does is that allows you to build your confidence in the feature flagging system. And this is great if you've never used feature flags before, because you can make sure that the data on both sides is the same. Next, I would say start small. So you're not going to start out with your most complex flow and say, yeah, that's the one I'm going to start with in production. Please don't do that. Start out with the simplest thing you can, like a small CSS change, like something that doesn't matter if it breaks because it's small. Start small and then grow. So the outcome of this is that we had higher confidence, we had increased developer velocity. Your developers and your team, they're going to spend less time fixing bugs and defects and more time creating new features, more time spent on more deliverables, because your bugs and defects are going to be found so much sooner in the testing lifecycle. Testing in prod promotes a very proactive engineering culture. So as a test engineer, I don't want to wait until something breaks, have a user report it to me, go figure out what it is, try to recreate it, and then report it back to my team as a bug. I want to fix any issues before anyone ever knows anything is wrong. I want to be proactive about it. I don't want to wait until something breaks and then go in and fix it. So there's always people who are like, I just can't test in prod. It's not an option. I can't do it. My company is like the government, and it's impossible. So in this case, if that's you, if you really, there's just zero way, you can spin up a containerized environment. You can use something like Docker to just, create a copy of prod, test there, and then get rid of the environment. Spin up an environment per build. That's an option. It's a good option if you are not able to test in prod. It's just not as good, again, because it is a copy of prod. It isn't actually production. So you'll still have some of the same issues, but it does that copy happens right before you run the test versus whenever your staging environment was created or updated. Okay, so if this is something that you want to do, a lot of times the hardest part of this is to shift your company's testing culture. So if this is something you want to do, explain why the pros outweigh the cons to your management. So is your staging environment unreliable? Yes, it is, except for apparently you three. Use examples from the past. So do you remember when we merged this thing to prod and it broke and it took down our whole system, but it was working in staging? And then propose a path forward. Like, I know a lot of the feature flagging tools have a free version that you can use. So like Split and LaunchDarkly both have it where you can just start using feature flags for free. So that's something that you could do. And this part is really funny because a lot of times, like, people are so scared to deploy new features, especially like whether to deploy on Fridays. And I was in the speaker room, the speaker lounge, and one of the speakers goes, "Oh, I just got this request for someone to deploy at 4 p.m. on a Friday. Like, how could they do that? Like, it's so late." And I'm like, if you're testing in prod, like, it's fine. Just deploy your code at any time. Like, do whatever you want. You don't have to, like, this fear of, like, I can't deploy on Friday. Like, I have to wait until, you know, Monday morning. Like, you don't have those discussions anymore when you're testing in prod. Like, that, you have so much more confidence in your releases. Okay, so we're almost done. There's always going to be these like negative Nancys, these people who are like, Talia, like, go back to LA. Like, this is never going to work. And to those people, I say 3 things. 1, staging will never fully represent prod. Like, I don't care how much work you put into your staging environment, it's never going to be an exact replica of production. It's a sunk cost. You're putting money into something that, again, is never going to be an exact replica. And these people are not my target audience. Like, the person who I'm picturing here, like, this person has been at the company for 20 years, like, in their cubicle, and they don't like change, and if that's you, I'm sorry, this presentation is not for you. But yeah, there's always going to be people who don't like this change, who don't like this innovation. Tough, I don't know. Testing in prod is like, it's an innovative thing. It's like an upcoming, like, emerging solution. And so if this is something that you are not open to and I haven't convinced you at all that this is a good idea, then you should tell me that. Okay, so to summarize the steps of testing in prod, the first thing you have to do is install your tools. So this is your feature flagging, your automation framework, your job schedule, your alerting tool. Create your test data and make sure your test entities only interact with each other. So like, if you have a test user, they log in and then they click on this like test button and they do this other, like, everything that is in that flow needs to be marked as like a test instance. Then you write your test, you make sure your teardown cleans up your test, you launch behind a feature flag, deploy to a production canary, and have a drink because you're testing in prod. Okay, if you haven't been paying attention at all for the past 40 minutes, I want you to take away 2 things. 1, no one cares if your feature is working in staging, we care if it works in production. And the only way to know if it's working in prod is to test it in prod. Okay, thank you, everybody. I can take questions now if anyone has questions. Yeah.
So our biggest problem at the moment is that we can't get a login insurance, and we can't get a policy to actually log in to the system. So in production, it goes to production, and in all honesty, we don't test production. If the logs say there's no errors, we're okay. It's all closed. We have no choice because of that. But that must be common. So someone solve this abuse.
That you're not able to get a test user to log in, like you can't create that process.
You can't buy a fake policy. There's like financial regulation there, so a bank would have the same problem. You can't create a fake bank account, so I can't log in.
Yeah, so this is something that I would work with like your IT people with to see if like there's a way to do it. And a lot of times if you convince someone in like your VPs or your higher ups that like this is something that you want to start doing, there are ways to do it. Like I used to work for a financial company and you can create fake bank accounts in prod. They just have to be marked a certain way. They're going to give you a really hard time about it and you're going to have to fight a little bit, but it is possible. There's no like one solution for every company too. Like if you really can't log in, there's no way for you to create test data. You can do this in something like Docker or something where you have like a containerized build, and you can log in with something like that. Yeah. Anything else? Okay, happy Friday.